Sometimes I think that the introduction of a speaker is perfunctory. This morning, especially, that is not the case. Originally, we were scheduled to hear today from Lynn Hybels, who in recent months has been on an extensive tour in the Middle East and beyond on a peacemaking mission. She was planning today to speak on the theme of Christ as our Prince of Peace. But just recently, as Melissa prayed, Lynn's father was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer, and she has canceled her entire travel schedule and speaking schedule to be with her parents in Michigan. So just a week ago, I went to Paul Robinson and I asked if he would be willing to speak in chapel today. I guess I had Paul Robinson in mind to speak on this occasion for a number of reasons. One, because of his own interest in global issues and peacemaking, but beyond that, because I didn't want to limit Paul to a particular theme or issue, I thought that it would be good and helpful for us all to hear from Dr. Paul Robinson before his retirement from Wheaton College at the end of this semester. As many of you know, Paul and his wife Margie are moving on to work with the Congo Initiative and a new university in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Over the last 13 years, a good number of students, especially hunger students, have been mentored by and encouraged by the director of the hunger program, Dr. Paul Robinson. But many other students have not had that same privilege, so today's chapel allows for that exposure. And I want to say one more thing. Over the years, Dr. Paul Robinson has helped me to bring world leaders, especially Africans, to the Wheaton College Chapel. And his partnership with the chaplain's office has been a behind-the-scenes blessing for us all. So please join me in welcoming today, as I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Robinson.
Well, as Chaplain Kello has just noted, I'm going to be leaving Wheaton soon to take up a call to work with a Congolese Christ-centered vision for transforming the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country in the heart of Africa, broken by misrule, decimated by war, trapped in hunger and poverty. I was born in the Congo, you see. I became a refugee at age 8 from that country, fleeing from armed militias, just like many Congolese are doing today. I buried my father in that country, too. It is a place for me of very deep pain, a pain that I would often rather forget. And yet, in that same country, I found joy unlike anywhere else in the world. In the beauty of its grasslands, its rainforests, its mountains, lakes, and rivers, in the friendship and the solidarity of its deeply African communities, but most of all in the worship and praise of Congolese Christians, brothers and sisters, many of whom I grew up with. I found the most incongruous hope in that place of deep brokenness. President Wheaton, in his inaugural address 2 years ago, quoted Frederick Buechner, "The place God calls you to is a place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet together," and that's Congo. So this past week, I've been reflecting on a lifetime, much of it in Africa, and these past 14 years here at Wheaton, much of it defined by being with Hunger's host communities around the world, and with Hunger students who have chosen to live among them, learn from, and identify with them. So with what do I want to leave you, Wheaton College, today, particularly as we draw into this season of Advent? I want to preface what I'm going to say this morning. I'm going to tell us maybe a story or two by paraphrasing Parker Palmer from his reflection entitled "The Risk of Incarnation." Parker Palmer notes that one of the most important gifts of the Christian tradition is the reality of the incarnation, the Word becoming flesh, embodied. In academic culture, the Word often becomes disembodied, he writes, and floats above things at an altitude that can't really connect with the human condition. The notion that the Word becomes embodied has powerful meaning for us. Incarnation is a gift, he continues. God takes the risk of showing up in a human body with all that comes with it. That is a risk we're all called to take. The risk of incarnation. the risk of embodying our values and beliefs, the risk of showing our identity and integrity in the world, the risk of being fully human, of entering into and living life, of having to deal with all that is life. It is a risk that we too often shy away from. 1 year ago, exactly, my mother, a missionary to Congo for more than 40 years, came to our home, to go home to heaven. We cared for her in the bedroom off of our living room for the last week of her life, and as it became for her a portal into the presence of God and into her time in eternity. I've been thinking long and deep about her life and her calling to take the good news to the heart of Africa. She lived that call through her entire life. What I had not known until just shortly before her death was my mother's crisis of faith in 1969, exactly halfway through her 40 years as a missionary. A few of you in my class may have heard this in a video that she recorded for us not long before she died. So it was exactly 43 years ago this weekend. I was a Saturday, the eve of Advent, November 29th, 1969. I was 17 and in boarding school in Congo, or in Kenya. 2 countries away, my father and mother were serving. And my dad had just gone over to Uganda to pick up the mail and to do some deliveries, and he'd come back to this little mission station in northeast Congo at a place called Adi. And he sat down with my mother and began to read the mail. My mother was sitting at her desk, entering grades. She was a teacher in a 4-year Bible school, training pastors. Literally 10 seconds later, he was no longer with us. He had a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died on the spot. It was graduation weekend at the Adi Bible School, and that last week in November, my mother had just been asked to do the chapel on Friday morning. She asked God to give her a message for the graduates for their Friday chapel, knowing that they would be serving their lifetimes in exceedingly difficult places. She knew those men loved to sing. My mother was a musician, Kathy. Part of her work was to teach music to these men. I mean, as if you need to teach Congolese music anyway, but she taught music. A message came to her of songs in hard places. How difficult it would be for them to have songs in the hard places that God would be calling them to, in the circumstances that they would face in their lives. And she didn't have a clue what those circumstances would be, but she knew that they were going to some of the most difficult places on that continent. So she talked about Paul and Silas in prison and God giving them songs in the night. She talked about the songs of Jeremiah. She talked about the psalmist songs in the daily routines, and she ended with a note from Job where it says, "I have caused even the widow's heart to sing for joy." She gave that message on a Friday morning. 24 hours later, my mother was a widow. She had no idea that that was going to happen. She didn't know that 24 hours later that she would have lost her husband. She prepared my father's body for burial. The students all came around with their wives and their families to the little house in which they lived. My mother was devastated. The men went back and they began to build a coffin out of wood from the local trees. They came back about midnight that night with the coffin all prepared to drive overnight to the funeral that was to take place in another mission station about 90 miles away. These Bible school students whom she had been talking with, mentoring, teaching, sharing her life with for the previous 4 years, came into her house. And my mother was sitting there. And my mother was an amazing woman. She had quite a little temper, too. They came into the room, and she said to them, "I can't." She said, "I prepared my husband for burial, but I can't put him in the coffin. You'll have to do that. Go into the bedroom. He's laying there. His body is there. Put him in the coffin for me." They went into the room. They put my father in the coffin. And my mother strode into the room. She had her Bangala Bible with her. She looked at this. She put this up like this, and she said to them, "I want you to know something." She said, "Yesterday I told you in chapel that when you leave here," she said, "God will give you a song even in the hard places that you go." And she said, "They told you that God would give the widow a song." She said, "My song is gone. I do not have a song." She said, "Unless," and she points the Bible at them like this, "unless God gives me a song, I'm going home." And you might as well go home to your villages because everything in this book is a lie. Everything in this book is a lie. She was upset. She was angry with God. God had disappeared from her life in those few hours. Men took my father's body in the coffin and they took it out to the car where it began its journey. My mother was alone the rest of the night in her home. What she didn't know was that these men went back to the little Bible school, to the little village, to the little communities where they were, and they got together and they brought their wives and said, "Come, we have to pray for Mama Jean." And all the rest of the night, these men, whom she was training, whom she had worked with for the previous 4 years, got together and they prayed all night that God would give my mother a song. As my mom relates this story, she chuckles and she said, "I stayed in Congo for more than 20 years. God gave me a song. He returned my song." What would she have missed if God hadn't come and been with her? If Emmanuel, God with us, had not lived up to his promise to give her a song of joy? What characterized those next 20 years? Over the past year, I've had the privilege of going through her letters, have all of her letters for 40 years to her mother. This was to be an extended period, nearly as long as the years that she and my father had lived and served together, of a life-giving, enduring work. You see, in her own loss and pain, and through her vulnerability with people around them, sharing the losses, Mom wrestled ever more deeply with the daily experiences of Congolese life, of its joy and its pain, now so much deeply more personalized in her. She crossed a threshold that took her more deeply into the lives of those she served, those to whom she ministered and those who ministered back to her. I remember then and more recently in my ongoing work in Congo, the astonishment to this day of the people that she would stay with them in Africa and not go back to her family after losing her husband, as she would give her entire life to them. Identification, immersion, a being with, these are the essential elements of incarnation, a theology, I would say, of presence. God gave her a life and a witness that deepened and matured in those long years without my father. Her letters speak of, and the innumerable photographs and slides show this season with Congolese pastors, women, students, friends, and children, helped and mentored. Just several quick highlights. Medical services in that part of Congo were virtually non-existent for anything but routine care, perhaps in part because of her own devastating loss. My mother could not stand by while people died from health situations that might be treatable and that were treatable just across the border in Uganda, just across the border, 50 miles, 3 hours over back-breaking roads in her car. Over and over again, she was presented with critical medical needs. She took to loading up her car with patients, running an informal ambulance service, traveling by herself over horrendous roads many times after dark, taking critically ill patients, often women with complicated labor issues, to the nearest hospital. Her compassionate response, born out of her own understanding of God's presence with her. My mother was an untiring student of the scriptures and a master teacher. She studied, wrote curricula, she simply called them lessons, and taught systematic theology, exegesis, biblical interpretation, hermeneutics, Old Testament, New Testament, biblical history, and more with her Moody Bible diploma. She was equipping and mentoring over 800 men in those 20 years who would become pastors in churches all over northeast Congo and beyond, together with their wives who would serve alongside of them. Now, my mother was of that persuasion that she could not stand up and preach in a church service. That was not her duty, and yet she taught all those men to be pastors. Yeah. You know, you can live subversively pretty easily. Finally, Mom became deeply concerned for the women of Congo, pouring her life into teaching and facilitating the development of a fledgling movement, women's movement, called Women of the Good News. Over the last 4 decades, this has grown to include tens of thousands of women all over Congo who support each other, learn together with each other, and who are enabled and empowered to live more fully and deeply. Amazing. God with us. It takes that in our lives to realize that God is with us. Understand that. No matter what you go through, understand that Emmanuel, God, has come into us, and he's with us. He's with us in everything that we experience. The promise is there, and it is true. Fast forward to 2002, 33 years later. The Congo was in the midst of a civil war, a devastating civil war that took between 4 million and 5 million people. Mom had retired from 4 decades of life and service in Congo when she was a few years younger, almost 15 years after her retirement, a retirement that wasn't really a retirement because she was teaching men and women here in the States all that time. She was invited by Congolese women to return to be the keynote speaker at their annual conference. Doesn't matter if it's the middle of a war. It was to be held near Adi Bible School, where she had taught those 20 years. She apprehensively agreed, and with 3 other 70-plus-year-old women, septuagenarians, from southern Wisconsin, flew to Uganda, traveled by road to Congo, just at the time when it was beginning to emerge, but was still deeply enmeshed in that civil war conflict. She was in poor health, struggling with severe sciatic pain. She could not walk unassisted and had to use a walker. She wondered if any of the women would remember her, and come. More than 4,000 did. Walking, bicycling, 10s, 20s, 30, 100 miles to see her. These women daily, for almost a week, sat in the tropical heat under rough shelter from dawn until after dusk to worship together and to hear her teach. They waited long hours to greet her, shake her hand, and receive a word from her. At the very same time, under the faculty missions project here at Wheaton, I was given the privilege to go back into Congo, into a war zone, to a place called Beni in North Kivu province, where today there's still ongoing conflict going on. As I traveled into Congo in an old DC-3 run by Samaritan's Purse, I wondered, what am I going into Congo for? Everybody else is coming out today, but moreover, what do I have for these people? I'm going into a place where suffering is so deep that I can't even begin to understand it. And I had a real crisis. Why would I go to Congo when my seat could have been taken on that airplane with blankets and other food supplies for refugees who were pouring in at that time to that city of North Beni? We landed in Beni. The roads were lined with people with brilliant Congolese cloths like this, welcoming us to Beni in the middle of the war zone. We could still hear the pop of small arms fire off in the distance and the occasional thump of our rocket-propelled grenades as we went into the middle of the city. For the next 6 or 7 days, we worked with Congolese pastors from all over northeast Congo who were exhausted by working with their people, by welcoming people into churches. At that time, over 200,000 Congolese were cared for by churches. It's one of the great untold stories of refugee relief when there was no other refugee relief. It was the people of God who took the refugees in from other places. And for a full week, we met together, we prayed together. Emmanuel, God with us. Those were the pastors that my mother trained that never would have been pastors had she left. Emmanuel, God with us. What does this say to us here, today, at Wheaton College? Do you remember Parker Palmer's words with which we began? That God in the incarnation takes the risk of showing up in a human body with all that comes with it. This is a risk that we're called to do. The risk of incarnation, the risk of embodying our values and beliefs, the risk of showing our identity and integrity in the world, the risk of being fully human, of entering into and living life, of having to deal with all that is life. This is what God did for us. This is what we celebrate. This is what we wait for in the incarnation. In order that we can also share that life and all of its complexities with others. But what it takes is our vulnerability. It takes our willingness and our commitment to being a part of that process, to engaging that process, to receiving that presence, and then to passing it on. Thank you. Thank you. And I think, Kathy, you're coming to give us another piece of music.